The words left my mouth before I decided to say them. Don't get in that car.
Don't get in
4
that car.
syllables, no breath behind them, torn out of a throat that spent all day saying please and thank you, and here's your package, have a good one. I didn't recognize my own voice. It came out lower than I speak, flatter, the way my mother used to sound right before she told a client the truth they didn't want translated back to them. To understand why a courier's scream stopped a 9-figure convoy on a Tuesday morning, you have to go back 3 hours to a spilled coffee and a stranger's contempt, because that is where every ugly, beautiful thing in this story actually starts. I am an omega. I say that first because the world says it first, whether I want it to or not, the moment it clocks my scent or my paperwork or the soft flinch in my shoulders when a man raises his voice. I deliver packages for Swiftline Courier and Freight, 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, on a bike with a crooked kickstand and a phone cracked so badly the map looks like it's underwater. That morning, a hedge fund receptionist named Blake made me wait 40 minutes for a signature, then told me I smelled like a bakery, like it was an insult, like sweetness was something you should apologize for. I said thank you and left before the shake in my hands could show. I have gotten very good at leaving before the shake shows. My name is Ren Holloway. I am 27. 3 years ago, I was a certified interpreter, Russian and Ukrainian into English, good enough that a federal courtroom once asked for me by name. Then the program that paid for court interpreters got cut in a budget season nobody bothered to notice, and my mother, who had done the same work for 20 years before me, lost her contract 2 months before mine, and lost her health insurance 1 month after that, and lost a heart condition no one caught in time 4 months after that. I buried her with money I didn't have. My sister Junie was 15 then. She is 19 now, on dialysis 3 days a week, waiting on a transplant list that moves slower than any bureaucracy I ever interpreted for. I deliver packages because it pays same day and asks no questions about gaps in a resume. Nobody in this city knows I speak Russian like I was raised in it, because I was. My mother spoke it to me in the kitchen the way other mothers hum lullabies. She left me one thing besides the debt, a cracked leather notebook, her old working notebook, phrases and slang and courtroom idioms scrawled in the margins in her handwriting, which I still carry in my bag out of habit, the way some people carry a rosary or a pocket knife. If you can name a thing, she used to tell me, tapping the cover, you can survive it. I didn't understand what she meant until the day I needed it to be true. That morning's last run took me to the loading dock beneath Draven Tower, 60 floors of glass holding up more money than my whole zip code would see in a decade. Draven Global ran shipping lanes and freight contracts and, if the business page was to be believed, roughly a third of the Port Authority's private security work. The company's owner had a name the tabloids liked more than her actual name, the Iron Widow. Cassia Draven. I had delivered to her building 40 times and never once seen her. She was a rumor in a glass tower, a woman security guards straightened their spines for before she'd even entered the room. I was wheeling a hand truck of proofing documents toward the service elevator when I heard 2 men near the executive bay speaking low, fast Russian, the kind with no vowels wasted on softness. New hires, I assumed, rotation security, black suits with earpieces that didn't quite fit the way old employees did. I wasn't listening on purpose. You don't choose what your ear catches when it was trained on a language before it was trained on much else. But one man said the word for bridge. Then he said 11:40, flat, like a time on a schedule. Then the other one said something that made my stomach drop before my mind finished translating it, make it look natural. I didn't decide to stop walking. My feet did it without asking me. Across the bay, the elevator doors were opening, and a woman I recognized from every headline I'd ever half read was walking toward a black car with her security escort thinning around her, the way a crowd thins around someone important enough that even bodyguards give her room to breathe. Cassia Draven. Tall, dark coat. A face built for boardrooms and funerals in equal measure. One of the two Russian-speaking men shifted his weight toward the open car door. I dropped the hand truck. I heard it clatter behind me like something falling out of my own chest. "Don't get in that car." I said it standing in the open, in front of 11 armed strangers and a woman worth more than my whole borough, and I had no plan for what came after those 5 words, except that I meant every one of them. 2 men in black had me on the concrete before the echo finished. A knee found the small of my back. Someone's hand closed around my wrist hard enough to bruise, and somewhere above me a voice barked a command in English that I registered only as noise, because my whole body had gone into the particular cold stillness that comes right before real fear, the kind that isn't loud, just very, very quiet. I smelled my own scent turn, the honeyed warmth of it souring thin and sharp, an omega's body doing what an omega's body does when it decides the danger is real. Then a single word cut through the noise, not shouted, just spoken with the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. Enough, the knee lifted off my back before I understood whose voice had moved it. I got my hands under me and looked up into a face I'd only ever seen printed in grayscale on a business page, and up close it was worse and better than the photographs. Worse because the eyes were colder, better because they were also, unmistakably, afraid in the split second before the mask came back down over it. Cassia Draven crouched to my eye level on a loading dock in a coat that probably cost more than my mother's funeral, and asked me, very quietly, what I had heard. I told her. Bridge, 1140. Make it look natural. I said the words in Russian first, out of instinct, the way you'd hand someone the original document before the translation, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, fast and unreadable. Her head of security, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw like a closed fist, stepped in close and said this was exactly the kind of theater a plant would run, noise and a scene, to get inside the perimeter on a lie. He looked at me like I was a stain on his morning. Cassia didn't look away from my face. "Say it again," she said, in Russian. Exactly as you heard it, I said it again. She answered me in Russian, fast, testing, a sentence with the grammar deliberately wrong in the middle, the kind of trap you set for someone claiming a fluency they don't have. I corrected her without thinking, the way you'd correct a client mid-deposition, out of pure professional reflex, and only after the words were out did I hear how it sounded. A courier correcting a billionaire's grammar on a loading dock, with my knee still throbbing from the concrete. Her head of security opened his mouth to object again. Cassia raised one hand, and he stopped like he'd hit a wall. She rose to her full height and looked past me at the 2 men by the car, who had gone very still, the particular stillness of men calculating an exit. "Get them into a room," she said, not to me. Separately, now, then she turned back and studied me the way you'd study a locked door you'd just been handed the key to. "You just told me not to get into my own car," she said, in front of my board's favorite headline. "Do you understand what happens to that car in the next hour if you're wrong?" "I understand what happens to you in the next hour if I'm right," I said. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile. "Walk with me," she said, and it wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite a command either. It landed somewhere I hadn't been offered in a very long time, a place that assumed I had a choice and simply expected me to make the right one. I caught it then, underneath the cold morning air and the exhaust and my own frightened sweat. Her scent, low and mineral, graphite and something like frost caught in evergreen needles. The smell of a person who has spent years training every soft thing out of themselves. I watched her nostrils flare just once and knew she'd caught mine too. Warm, sweet, apricot, and sun-heated cotton. The smell of a body that had just been afraid and hadn't finished being afraid yet. We crossed the loading dock together while men in suits dismantled her car door panel with tools I didn't recognize, and somewhere behind us someone swore in 3 languages at once, and I understood, walking into the elevator with Cassia Draven's hand not quite touching my elbow. Not touching it. That whatever version of my life I'd been living that morning had just ended, cleanly, like a door closing on a street I would never walk down again. The elevator doors sealed us in gold-lit silence, 60 floors of glass waiting above us, and I thought, absurdly, of my mother's notebook still zipped in my bag against my hip. If you can name a thing, you can survive it. I had just named a bomb out loud in front of the person it was built for. I had no idea yet what surviving that would cost either of us. They found the device 40 minutes later, wired into the brake line under a rear seat, small enough to be missed by anyone not looking for it, and precise enough to make sure no one walking away from that bridge would need to look twice. Cassia's head of security, whose name I learned was Ezra Klein, delivered the report in the clipped voice of a man rearranging his entire understanding of the morning around one uncomfortable fact. A courier off the street had just saved his employer's life, and he had put his knee in her back for it. I sat in a glass-walled conference room 40 floors up, my knuckles split from the concrete. A paper cup of coffee going cold in front of me that nobody had asked if I wanted, and I understood without being told that I wasn't a guest. I was evidence. A loose end in someone else's war, still bleeding from the edges. Ezra didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed and looked at me the way you'd look at something that had wandered onto a factory floor. Delivery girl hears 2 words of Russian and calls it a bomb threat, he said. Not quite to me. Not quite to the room. Lucky guess. Or good theater. It was 6 words, I said. And it wasn't luck. My mother taught interpreters. I've been reading transcripts of exactly this kind of language since I was 9 years old. If you want, I can tell you the dialect wasn't Moscow standard. It had a Rostov drawl on the vowels. Whoever hired those men didn't hire locals. Ezra's jaw did something complicated. Cassia, seated across from me with her coat finally off, watched that exchange with an expression I was starting to recognize as her version of surprised. She asked what else I'd heard, and I gave it back to her the way I'd give back a deposition. Clean, exact, no padding. The second man's voice, lower and older than the first's, a third presence near the car that never spoke at all, which told me more than anything they'd said, because silence in that line of work usually means the person in charge. She wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. I got the sense, watching her, that she filed things the way I did, permanently. The way you file a phrase, you'll need to translate again someday. When the debrief ended, she didn't send me home. She had someone bring food instead, not catering trays. A bowl of something that made my chest ache before I'd even placed the smell. Dill and sour cream and dough. The same vareniki my mother used to make on Sundays with too much salt because she said grief tasted better honest. I hadn't mentioned that dish to anyone in this building. I found out later I'd said it, offhand, to a junior aide taking notes on my statement, one detail among 50, and somebody had actually listened. "You can't go home tonight," Cassia said, watching me eat like she was cataloging the exact moment my shoulders came down from my ears. Whoever hired those men knows your face now. My people will find you a room here until we understand the size of what you walked into. I don't need charity, I said, too fast, old reflex. It isn't charity, she said. It's containment. You're the only witness who can identify the language on that recording device. That makes you a problem for someone with a great deal of money. I intend to keep my problems where I can see them. It should have sounded cold. It landed instead like the first true safety I'd felt in 3 years, and I hated how grateful that made me. Ezra walked me through the residential floor himself, sour the whole way, until he stopped outside a door and, almost as an afterthought, asked how a courier ends up fluent enough to correct his boss's grammar on a loading dock. I told him the short version: mother, courtroom, budget cuts, debt. He didn't say anything kind. He said, "Don't touch anything in that apartment that isn't yours," and left, and I understood that was the closest thing to reassurance he had in him. The suite they gave me had more square footage than my entire building back home. I sat on the edge of a bed that could have fit 4 of me and pulled out my mother's notebook out of habit, running my thumb over the cracked spine. And that was when Cassia knocked, once, and let herself half into the doorway without crossing the threshold, which I noticed, and appreciated more than I said. She'd changed out of the coat into something plainer, and up close, off the clock of her own building, she looked less like a headline and more like a woman who hadn't slept properly in longer than she'd admit. She held out a small case. "Antiseptic," she said, "for your hand." I hadn't realized how much my knuckle still throbbed until she took my wrist, gently, asking with her eyes before her fingers closed, and I gave the smallest nod. Permission passed between us without either of us saying the word, and cleaned the split skin with a care that didn't match anything I'd read about her in any headline. Her thumb pressed once, testing, and I felt the warmth of her skin against mine longer than the task required, and neither of us pulled back first. "Whoever hired those men," she said, not looking up from my hand, "used a contractor called Nord Vector. My chief operating officer brought them on last month. Told the board it was a cost efficiency. I should have asked more questions. Why didn't you? I asked. Because I trust my own people less than I should, and I trust outsiders even less than that, she said, and something in her voice went somewhere far away and cold, a door I could feel closing even as she spoke. I didn't push it. Not yet. She left not long after, and I lay awake in a bed the size of a small apartment, replaying the particular way her hand had held mine like something worth being careful with. Near midnight, Ezra's voice came through the room's intercom, clipped and grim. "Both men from the loading dock," he said. "Gone from every log in the building. No badge scans, no elevator footage, nothing. Like they were never here at all." I sat up in the dark with my mother's notebook still open on my knees and understood, the way you understand a diagnosis before the doctor says it out loud, that whatever had almost happened on that loading dock wasn't finished. It had only just started looking for a new way in. Ezra pulled the security footage himself the next morning, jaw tight the whole time. And what it showed put a name on the danger faster than any of us wanted. 2 weeks before the loading dock, a purchase order authorizing Nord Vector's full rotation onto the executive detail had gone through with a single signature, bypassing the usual 3-person vetting chain. The signature belonged to Desmond Price, Draven Global's chief operating officer, a man I had never met, and within the hour, would come to understand I never wanted to. Cassia called the meeting herself, board members filing into a glass room on the 58th floor with the particular unhurried arrogance of people who have never once worried a bomb might be meant for them. I wasn't supposed to be in that room. She brought me in anyway, seated me at her right hand, and I watched 11 faces recalibrate around the fact that the courier from yesterday's incident report was now sitting at their table like she belonged there. Price arrived last. Broad through the shoulders, silver at the temples, a voice pitched to fill rooms without ever seeming to raise itself, the particular register of a man who has spent 30 years being obeyed. He looked at the purchase order Ezra slid across the table, looked at me, and smiled the way men like him smile at women like me, like I was a clever trick he intended to enjoy dismantling. A courier, he said, tasting the word like something faintly distasteful. Sitting in on a board security review. Tell me, dear, do you also weigh in on the freight tariffs, or is bomb detection your only area of expertise? I heard two men plan an assassination in a language you clearly never bothered learning, I said. That's my only area of expertise this week. His smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. He turned to the board instead of me, voice smoothing into concern. I find it curious, he said, that our security breach coincides so precisely with the arrival of an outsider with documented family ties to the exact region Nordvector recruits from. Her mother, I'm told, worked Eastern European court dockets for 20 years. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking the room to consider the timing. The room considered it. I watched 3 board members' faces shift, not towards suspicion of him, but towards suspicion of me, the fastest reversal I had ever witnessed a lie perform in real time. My chest went tight and hot with an old familiar shame, the exact shape of every time someone had turned my mother's accent into an accusation. Cassia's voice, when it came, was very quiet, and it was the coldest thing I had heard in that room all morning. Desmond, she said. She warned me. You signed the order that let the threat in the door. Explain to me again which of those 2 facts should concern this board. He recovered fast, pivoted to protocol, to liability, to the optics of housing an unvetted civilian inside protective custody while an internal investigation was pending, and by the time the vote came, the board had split down a line drawn entirely by fear of headlines rather than fear of truth. My provisional custody, they decided, would need review. Effective immediately, I was to be relocated outside company premises pending the outcome of an internal inquiry into my own background. Cassia didn't argue in the room. She waited until the doors closed behind the last board member, and then she looked at Ezra and said one word. Pack her. Ma'am. Ezra started, and she cut him off without raising her voice. The board can review a policy. They don't get a vote on who lives. Get the car. Not the tower car. Mine. 3 hours later, we were an hour outside the city on a private road I hadn't known existed, gravel giving way to pine, a lake house tucked so far back into the trees it didn't appear on any map I'd have found on my own. Cassia drove herself, both hands on the wheel the entire way, eyes flicking to the mirrors more than the road, and I understood, watching her, that this wasn't paranoia. This was a woman who had learned somewhere exactly what it cost to trust the wrong driver. The house was warm and unshowy in a way the tower wasn't. Low ceilings, a wood stove, a kitchen that looked used rather than staged. She built a fire without being asked and didn't speak until it caught, and in that silence I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since my mother died, the specific relief of being somewhere no one wanted anything from me except to stay alive. It was near midnight when the first window broke. Ezra's voice crackled over a radio I didn't know Cassia carried. Warning of a vehicle stopped on the access road with no plates and its engine still running. And then the glass went before he finished the sentence. Cassia had me on the floor and behind the stone hearth before I understood I'd been moved, her body angled over mine in the dark, and I felt, absurdly, in the middle of gunfire chewing through the front room. the steadiness of her heartbeat, where my hand had landed flat against her chest. We went out the cellar door into black pine woods, her hand locked around mine, both of us running low and fast between trees that scraped my arms raw, until we found the old stone spring house half buried in the hillside and folded ourselves into it, so close in that narrow dark that I could feel her breath against my hair. "They'll check every structure on the property," she said, voice barely above a whisper, mouth close enough to my ear that I felt each word more than heard it. "We stay quiet. We stay still. I need you to trust me for the next 20 minutes more than you've ever trusted anyone." "I already do," I whispered back, and meant it more than I expected to. We heard them pass twice, boots in wet leaves, a flashlight beam sliding across the springhouse door and away again, and both times her arm tightened around me like a wall going up, and both times, underneath the terror, I registered the particular clean cold of her scent gone sharp with adrenaline. Graphite and frost pine turned almost bitter, with fear for someone who wasn't herself. When Ezra's team finally cleared the property near 2 in the morning, we came up out of the dark shaking, and I saw the graze along her forearm where a round had come close enough to open skin, blood dark against her sleeve, and something in me broke open at the sight of it, some wall I'd been holding since the loading dock. "You're hurt," I said stupidly, reaching for her arm. "It's shallow," she said, "and let me hold it anyway. Let me press my sleeve against the wound with hands that hadn't stopped shaking, and in the dark, adrenaline still roaring through both of us, she looked at me with something raw and unguarded that the tower version of her would never have allowed to surface. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and it isn't fair timing, but I don't know when I'll have the nerve again." "Ask," I said. She didn't. Not with words. She looked at my mouth and then at my eyes, and I understood the question anyway and answered it the only way that mattered. "Tell me to stop," she breathed, "an inch from my mouth, and I will." "Don't stop," I said. The kiss that followed was careful in a way nothing else about that night had been. Her hand cupping my jaw like something she was afraid of breaking, mine fisted in the front of her ruined shirt, both of us tasting like smoke and adrenaline, and something neither of us had let ourselves want out loud until the world had tried to take it away first. When we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine, breathing hard, and said, so quietly, I almost missed it. "There's something about my wife you don't know yet. I need you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." Before I could ask, headlights swept the tree line, and Ezra's voice called out through the dark, and the door of what was left of that night opened wide enough to let the rest of the world back in. Ezra's people secured a second safe house by dawn, a narrow stone cottage an hour further out, and it was there, 3 days later, with her arm properly stitched and both of us running on borrowed sleep, that Kasaya finally told me about Elena. We sat at a scarred kitchen table while she cleaned the same wound for the second time, refusing to let anyone else touch it, and she told the story the way people tell things they've rehearsed alone in the dark for years and never once said out loud. 5 years ago, her wife had died in what the papers called a mechanical failure on a coastal road at night. Brakes gone. No skid marks. Cassia had been the one to identify her at the morgue. It took 3 years and a forensic accountant she trusted with her life to prove what she'd known in her body from the first hour. The car had been sabotaged. The same precise, patient work as the device found under her own seat 2 days ago. She never found who ordered it. The investigation went cold. She rebuilt herself instead into someone the world called the Iron Widow, someone who checked every exit in every room because someone had to, because keeping a person safe, she said, meant noticing what they didn't notice about themselves. I will always notice what you don't, she said, looking at the stitches instead of at me, like the sentence cost her something to say and she needed somewhere else to put her eyes while she said it. That's the only promise I know how to make anymore. I gave her mine back in kind. I told her about my mother's notebook, the one still zipped in my bag, and read her one of the margin notes in my mother's looping handwriting, a Russian idiom about naming a fear to take its teeth, and told her that was the whole of what my mother left me besides debt, and that it had gotten me through every bad room I'd walked into since. Kasaya took the notebook from my hands like it was something sacred, turned it over once, and gave it back with a gentleness that told me she understood exactly what it was. We cooked that night, badly, both of us laughing at how neither of us could manage dough the way our mothers had. Flour on her sleeves, on my collarbone, her hands finding my waist from behind at the stove in a way that had nothing to do with rescue, and everything to do with two people finally exhaling. For one evening, in that narrow kitchen, the war outside the walls went quiet. It was still quiet when my phone buzzed near midnight, an unknown number, no message, just a photograph. Junie's hospital room. The dialysis chair empty, her blanket on the floor. No note, no demand yet, just the picture, and the silence after it, which was somehow louder than anything that had come before. I didn't sleep again that night. Neither did Cassia. By morning, the warmth in that kitchen felt like it belonged to someone else's life. By noon, the second photograph arrived, and this one came with a voice. The call routed through a number Ezra couldn't trace, a modulated voice thin and metallic over the line, but the words underneath it were plain enough. Bring the widow to the dockside warehouse on 9th by midnight. Alone, no police, no security, or the sister doesn't make it to her next appointment. Kasaya's face went somewhere I hadn't seen it go before, past cold into something almost still. The particular stillness of a person doing violence to their own panic in real time, so it wouldn't show. She was already moving toward the gun safe in the cottage's back room before the call finished, and I understood in that moment that the woman who had promised to notice what I didn't notice about myself was about to walk into a warehouse alone and die for it, and I was not going to let that happen twice in one lifetime. For anyone. At the same time, the story broke on every business channel in the city, leaked, I'd learn later, from inside Draven Global itself, the Iron Widow harboring an unvetted courier under suspicion of foreign ties, bored in open revolt, stock sliding before the opening bell finished ringing. Price's name wasn't on a single headline. His fingerprints were on all of them. I need you to listen to something before you do anything else, I said, grabbing her wrist before she reached the door, and I played back the recording Ezra had pulled off the call, slowed, isolated, under the modulation, threaded through 3 sentences of English, was a single Russian phrase, an idiom, the kind you only use if you learned the language in a specific region from specific people. Rostov drawl. The same accent from the loading dock. Whoever was on that call wasn't hiring the threat. He was standing inside it. That's not a contractor's voice, I said. That's Price. Cassia went very still. He speaks 4 languages, she said slowly, working it forward. He never mentioned Russian. He didn't need to, I said. He just needed one man on his payroll who did, feeding him phrases to sound foreign enough to hide behind. I flipped open my mother's notebook, ran my finger down a page of her old margin notes on regional dialects and dock terminology from her interpreting days, and found what I was looking for, a listing of import warehouses along the old freight line she'd worked cases out of for a decade. 9th among them, cross-referenced in her own hand with a name I recognized from Ezra's financial trace an hour earlier, a shell company routing payments to Nordvector. My mother mapped that whole district 20 years ago, I said. I know that warehouse. I know it's second door. Cassia looked at me for a long moment, something fierce and frightened, and entirely undisguised moving across her face. We go together, she said. Not because I doubt you, because I am done letting anyone I love walk into a building alone. Ezra assembled what he could without alerting the board. 6 of his most trusted, no police yet, because a police response risked forcing Price's hand before Junie was clear. We went in through the second door at 11:40, the same number, I realized with a cold jolt, that the men on the loading dock had used for the bridge, and understood that whatever clock Price operated on, he liked his numbers to repeat, liked the symmetry of using the same minute to open 2 different kinds of violence. We found Junie Zip tied to a chair in a cold office off the main warehouse floor, frightened but unhurt, and I don't remember crossing the distance to her. Only that my hands were shaking too hard to undo the ties, and Cassia's weren't, and that she got my sister free in under a minute with the calm efficiency of someone who had trained herself for exactly this kind of night more times than anyone should have to. Price found us before we found the exit. He came through the warehouse floor with 2 Nordvector men flanking him, and up close, without a boardroom table between us, he looked smaller than his voice, the way cruelty always does once you've stopped being afraid of it. He confessed the way men like him always do when they believe they've already won. Elena, 5 years ago, an insurance play and a hostile buyout dressed up as tragedy. The investigation he'd made sure went cold. This second attempt built on the same design because it had worked once, and greed rarely bothers inventing new methods. Cassia's hand found the gun at her hip, and for one long second I watched 5 years of grief look for somewhere to land. I stepped between her and the reach of that decision, not brave, just certain, and said the only thing I had. "Don't become the thing that made you cold," I said. "Let him rot in a room instead. That's worse for a man like him than dying ever would be." Her hand stopped. Ezra's team took Price and both his men down before he finished reaching for whatever he thought his exit was, and by the time the first police units arrived, drawn by Ezra's call the moment Junie was clear, the fight had already ended in restraint instead of ruin. Which felt, standing in that cold warehouse with my sister's arms around my neck, like the only kind of victory that wouldn't cost Cassia something she couldn't get back. Dawn came up gray and clean over the dockside as the warehouse emptied into flashing lights, and Cassia stood beside me with blood on her sleeve that wasn't hers this time, watching a man who had killed her wife get read his rights on a stretch of concrete that smelled like salt and diesel, and for the first time since I'd met her, she let out a breath like she'd been holding it for 5 years. The board called an emergency session 2 days later, and this time, Cassia didn't ask permission to bring me into the room. She played Ezra's recording from the warehouse floor for the full company, and every camera the press could fit through the door, Price's own voice confessing to Elena's death, and the second attempt in one unbroken confession. Followed by the financial ledger tracing 5 years of shell payments back through Nordvector to a Rostov-based backer, with more grievances against Draven Global's port contracts than patience for waiting out a lawsuit. The board that had voted to strip me of protective custody a week earlier sat in silence while the truth they dismissed as theater from a courier played out loud in their own boardroom. Ezra stood at the back of that room with his arms crossed, and when a junior board member leaned over to ask him, quietly, whether the courier's story had checked out, he said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "In 11 years, I have never once seen this woman wait on anyone." She waited for Ren Holloway to finish speaking before she moved. That's the only vote I needed. Price was arrested on live feed before the session ended, his shell companies exposed line by line, his backer's name handed to federal investigators before noon. The market that had punished Draven Global's stock a week earlier sent it climbing back within the hour. But Cassia didn't watch the numbers. She watched the door of that boardroom, and when it finally cleared, she crossed the room in front of everyone, still lingering with cameras in hand, and took my face in both her hands like she'd been waiting 5 years for permission to do exactly that in public. I have spent 5 years making sure no one could ever again use what I love against me, she said, loud enough for the room, quiet enough that it felt like it belonged only to me. I am done hiding what that costs. I love you. I would like the whole city to know it, if you'll let them. Tell me to stop, I said, laughing through something that wasn't quite tears, and I will. Don't stop, she said, and kissed me in front of a room full of people who had spent a week deciding whether I was worth believing. That night, back at the tower, in the quiet after the cameras and the statements, and Junie finally sleeping safe 2 floors below us, Cassia asked me formally, the way the old customs required, hand open and steady, for permission to claim me, to press her teeth to the gland at my throat and make permanent what both our bodies had already decided in a spring house in the dark. Tell me to stop, she said one more time, and I will, always, for as long as you need me to. Don't stop, I told her, and meant it with everything left in me, and when her mouth closed over the mark, gentle even in that moment of old, fierce claiming, I felt something settle into place between us that no board vote or bullet or 5-year-old grief would ever be strong enough to break again. The bond opened between us warm and total, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt entirely, permanently seen. 6 months later, on a morning with frost still silvering the lake house windows, Cassia knelt on the same kitchen floor where we'd once burned dough and asked me a second question with a small box instead of a car door. And I said yes before she finished the sentence, laughing, both of us crying in a way neither of us would have allowed the old versions of ourselves to do. We married in early spring, in that same low-ceilinged house, small enough that it fit everyone who actually mattered, Junie, restored and glowing after a transplant funded quietly by a restitution fund carved out of Price's seized assets. Ezra, stiff in a suit he clearly hated, who stood and said in front of everyone that he had spent 15 years watching this woman run toward danger and none at all watching her wait for someone, until the day a courier taught her how, Petra, an old interpreter friend of mine, who hugged me hard and told me, without a trace of bitterness, that she was glad the right person finally saw what she'd always seen in me, before slipping quietly back into the crowd, exactly where she wanted to be. Our vows were short. I promised to keep naming the things that frightened her until they lost their teeth. She promised, in the same words she'd given me barefoot in a burned kitchen, that she would always notice what I didn't notice about myself for as long as either of us was breathing. A year on, Draven Global runs its executive language and threat assessment division out of a floor Cassia built and named after nobody but staffed, top to bottom, with people the old company would never have looked at twice, including, at the head of it, a former court interpreter who once corrected a CEO's grammar on a loading dock and never really stopped. Junie is finishing a nursing degree on a scholarship neither of us had to ask twice for. Nordvector no longer exists under any name a court can find. On the morning I'm remembering now, the one I keep coming back to, sunlight comes in low and gold across the lake house sill, and my mother's cracked notebook sits open beside a second one, newer, given to me by Cassia the week we married, its first page in her careful hand, for every name you'll ever need to survive what comes next, and I'll be standing beside you for the rest. Cassia sleeps still beside me in that light, her scent gone soft and warm in a way it never was the day we met, and I understand now what my mother meant, all those years of margin notes and courtroom mornings, more completely than I ever did translating it for someone else's fear. You survive the unnamed thing by naming it out loud, even when your voice shakes. Even when no one has ever once believed you before. Somewhere, someone is always listening for exactly the words you're brave enough to say first. Being seen was never about being chosen by someone powerful. It was about someone finally being patient enough and honest enough to look. The end.